I never imagined I'd be sitting in a police interrogation room on my 5th wedding anniversary, trying to convince a detective that my own wife was framing me. But that's getting ahead of the story. To understand how everything unraveled, how the woman I loved turned into someone I barely recognized, we need to go back 3 months to the day I first noticed the legal documents hidden in Emma's desk drawer. The papers were partially concealed beneath tax returns, but I caught a glimpse of official letterhead while searching for our mortgage statement. I didn't read them then. I wish I had, but that flash of legal jargon sparked the first whisper of unease. Looking back, it was like seeing the shadow of a storm on the horizon while standing in perfect sunshine. I'm Nathan Chun, 34, an architectural engineer who believed in building things to last. Emma is 32, a marketing executive whose creativity had always complemented my methodical nature. We met at a mutual friend's gallery opening, where she'd spent 20 minutes explaining why the seemingly chaotic sculpture in front of us actually represented perfect mathematical harmony. I fell in love with her mind first, then everything else. That evening, after discovering the papers, I watched her prepare dinner in our kitchen. She moved with the same grace I'd always admired, but something felt different. Her smile seemed rehearsed, her casual questions about my day too pointed. The Richardson project is finally wrapping up, I mentioned, studying her reaction. The client's transferring the final payment tomorrow. Pretty substantial sum. A flicker of something? Interest? Calculation? Crossed her face before she turned back to the stove. That's wonderful, honey. We should celebrate. Later that night, I caught her on her phone, typing rapidly. He mentioned the payment. Yes, tomorrow. Everything's proceeding exactly as. She stopped abruptly when she noticed me in the doorway. Just updating the team about a client, she said smoothly, but her finger twitched as she locked her screen, a tell I'd never noticed before. That night, lying beside her in bed, I remembered something odd from last week. Emma insisting I sign a stack of documents for our investment portfolio without reading them, rushing me because we were late for dinner. It's just routine updates, she'd said, hand resting on my shoulder with unfamiliar weight. I didn't know then that I was watching the first act of an elaborate performance, one that would eventually lead to handcuffs and accusations. I didn't realize that my wife, the woman who used to leave love notes in my laptop bag and knew exactly how I took my coffee, was orchestrating the systematic destruction of everything we'd built together. But that's the thing about trust. It's like looking through pristine glass. You don't notice it's there until it starts to crack. The morning after discovering those legal documents, I woke to find Emma sitting at our bedroom vanity, methodically applying her makeup. The familiar ritual suddenly seemed strange, like watching someone don a mask with practiced precision. In the mirror's reflection, I caught her studying me, thinking I was still asleep. The calculation in her gaze made my skin crawl. You were restless last night, she said without turning, her voice carrying a note of concern that felt rehearsed. Bad dreams. I watched her hands move steadily, remembering how they used to tremble slightly when she was nervous, like during her speech at our wedding. Now they moved with surgeon-like precision, each gesture deliberate and controlled. The woman I married had always worn her emotions like watercolors, bleeding into each other. This Emma's feelings seemed coordinated, like paint by numbers. Just work stress, I lied, matching her performance. The Richardson project payment weighed heavily on my mind, not because of the project itself, but because of Emma's too keen interest in it. I'd never mentioned exact figures to her before, yet last night she'd seemed to be waiting for that specific information. Later that morning, I made an excuse about forgotten documents and circled back home. Emma's car was still in the driveway, despite her early meeting. Through the window, I saw her pacing our living room, phone pressed to her ear. The account details are confirmed. Her voice drifted through the partially open window. No, he doesn't suspect. Yes, I know exactly what's at stake. The salon appointment will provide the perfect. She moved out of earshot. Sano appointment. Something clicked in my memory. Emma had started going to a new hairdresser 2 months ago, someone she'd met through a work connection. She'd been oddly insistent about keeping her appointments, even rescheduling important client meetings around them. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through our shared calendar. Every Thursday afternoon like clockwork. Hair appointment. Vince's studio. But when I'd surprise her at the office last week on a Thursday, she'd been there, supposedly working late. The contradiction sat like ice in my stomach. That evening, Emma suggested we update our life insurance policies. Just being practical, she said, sliding the papers across our antique dining table, the one she'd been trying to replace. With the Richardson project wrapping up, it's a good time to reassess our financial situation. I studied her face in the warm light of our dining room. This woman who wore my wife's features but somehow seemed like a stranger. She'd order my favorite takeout, worn the blue dress I loved, created the perfect setting for this conversation. Everything felt staged, like evidence being planted at a crime scene. "I'll look these over later," I said, watching disappointment flicker across her face before she smoothed it away. "Of course," she smiled, but her fingers drummed once on the table, a tell I'd never noticed before. "No rus. Though the sooner we update them, the better protected we'll be." Protected from what? I wondered, as she cleared the dishes with domestic efficiency. That night, I lay awake listening to her make another hush phone call from our en-suite bathroom, the words timeline and evidence drifting through the door like poison. Memory plays strange tricks when trust begins to crumble. Sitting in my home office that weekend, surrounded by old photos of Emma and me, I found myself questioning everything. Even the smile she wore in our honeymoon pictures. Had it always held that hint of reservation, that shadow of ulterior motive? Or was I reverse engineering our happiness, painting our past with the colors of my present suspicion? The Richardson project payment had cleared, a substantial sum that should have felt like triumph. Instead, it sat in our account like a loaded gun, making me question every casual glance Emma cast at her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. That afternoon, while Emma was supposedly at her salon appointment, I found myself drawn to her home office. The room still held traces of her perfume, but underneath it lurked something else, the sharp scent of printer toner, fresh and chemical. Her printer displayed a count of 30 pages printed that morning, but the wastepaper basket was empty, too empty. Her laptop sat closed on the desk, its surface gleaming with the same immaculate care she'd been applying to everything lately. Next to it lay a business card I'd never seen before. Vincent DeMario, legal consultant. The card stock felt expensive between my fingers, the embossing catching the light like a warning. My phone buzzed. A text from our neighbor, Carol. "Everything okay? Just saw Emma heading into the city. Thought she had a hair appointment today." The message hit me like a physical blow. I sat in Emma's office chair, letting the implications wash over me. The salon appointments, the legal consultant's card, the missing printed papers, the life insurance forms. Pieces of a puzzle I couldn't, or perhaps didn't want to solve. My hands shook as I opened her desk drawer, the one that had contained those legal documents I'd glimpsed weeks ago. They were gone now, but something else caught my eye. A small notebook, its pages filled with Emma's precise handwriting. Most entries were mundane. Meeting notes, shopping lists, but one page made my blood run cold. In schedule, predictable. Home 6:30. Gym Tuesday/Thursday. Running trail Sat AM. Financials, joint account accessible. Separate accounts maintained. Evidence needs to be. The entry cut off there, as if she'd been interrupted. Below it, a series of dates and times, meticulously noted. My running trail times. My gym schedule. My routine, documented like surveillance notes. The sound of the garage door opening sent me scrambling to return everything exactly as I'd found it. I made it to the kitchen just as Emma walked in, her hair unchanged despite her supposed salon visit. She carried a manila envelope that disappeared in her tote bag when she saw me. "You're home early," she said, and for the first time, I heard the careful modulation in her voice, the way she adjusted her tone to project just the right mix of surprise and warmth. "Just feeling a bit under the weather," I replied, watching her process this information, seeing the microscopic adjustments in her expression. "Poor baby," she said, reaching up to feel my forehead. Her wedding ring caught the light, and I noticed something I'd somehow missed before. It wasn't the original ring I'd given her. This one was newer, a perfect replica, but not the same ring that had trembled on her finger the day she said "I do." What else about my wife was a replica? I wondered, as she busied herself making tea I hadn't asked for, humming a tune that seemed designed to convey domestic contentment. What else had been carefully constructed to look exactly like love? That night, sleep eluded me like a fickle friend. The gentle rhythm of Emma's breathing beside me, once a lullaby of comfort, now felt like the steady tick of a time bomb. In the darkness, I could almost convince myself that nothing had changed, that the woman lying next to me was still the same one who used to leave origami cranes on my pillow, each containing a handwritten reason why she loved me. The notebook's revelations haunted me. My own routine documented in her elegant handwriting felt like a violation, intimate and cold at the same time, like a lover's kiss delivered with eyes wide open. What purpose could such detailed surveillance serve? The question prowled the edges of my consciousness, a predator I wasn't ready to face. Morning arrived with the scent of coffee and croissants, Emma's latest character choice in her domestic performance. She'd started baking recently, filling our home with aromas that should have been comforting, but instead felt like another layer of calculated manipulation. I was thinking, she said, carefully casual as she spread honey on her croissant, maybe we should look into upgrading our home security system. After what happened to the Andersons next door, nothing had happened to the Andersons. I'd had coffee with Jim Anderson just yesterday. Their biggest crisis was their daughter's college applications. The lies slipped from her lips as smoothly as the honey dripping from her spoon. What happened to the Andersons? I asked, watching her face for the tell I'd begun to recognize, that microscopic pause before a fabrication. Oh, you hadn't heard? A break-in attempt last week. Carol mentioned it to me. She took a measured sip of coffee, her new wedding ring. The replica that replaced the original without explanation, catching the morning light. Later, alone in my car, I called Carol. Break-in at the Andersons? First I've heard of it. Break-in? Carol's confusion confirmed what I already knew. No, nothing like that. Though I did see Emma yesterday, heading into the city when she was supposed to be at. She stopped abruptly, as if realizing she was sharing something she shouldn't. I pulled into a parking lot, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Opening my laptop, I accessed our home security system's footage, the one Emma didn't know I'd installed after finding those legal documents. The footage from yesterday showed her leaving not with a salon bag, but with a thick manila envelope, meeting a man in a black SUV 2 blocks away. The video quality wasn't great, but I could have sworn I'd seen that man before, perhaps in a photo on that legal consultant's business card. Vincent DeMario. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Thinking of you. Remember when we talked about upgrading our life insurance? The advisor mentioned something about policyholders needing to be health screened. Maybe we should schedule that soon? The pieces were there, like a jigsaw puzzle dumped across our dining room table, but my mind refused to assemble them. The surveillance notes, the false salon visits, the mysterious legal consultant, the focus on life insurance, the Richardson Project payment sitting in our account like bait in a trap. I opened our banking app, staring at that payment amount. Something about the number tickled my memory. I'd seen it before, scrawled in Emma's notebook, but in a different context. Pulling up the photo I'd surreptitiously taken of her notes, I found it. The same figure, followed by 3 words that made my blood run cold. Minimum criminal threshold. The phrase minimum criminal threshold pulsed in my mind like a warning beacon as I sat in my parked car, watching rain trace patterns on the windshield. Each droplet carried a memory. Emma teaching me to dance in a summer storm, her laughter echoing across our backyard. Emma holding my hand through my father's funeral, her strength unwavering. Emma planning our future with architect's precision, every detail mapped out like evidence in a case. My phone lit up with another text from her. Made your favorite lasagna for dinner. Early night in. The domestic gesture felt hollow now, like flowers at a funeral. I could picture her in our kitchen, measuring ingredients with the same precision she'd used to document my daily routines. Each act of love now revealed as calculation. Instead of driving home, I found myself parking outside Vince's studio, her supposed salon. The storefront was dark, permanent-looking paper covering its windows. A for lease sign hung in the window, its weathered edges suggesting it had been there for months. All those Thursday appointments, all those perfectly styled excuses, they dissolved like sugar in rain. My hand trembled as I dialed Carol's number. How long has that salon been closed? Vince's? Honey, that place has been empty since before Christmas. No. She hesitated, her voice dropping. I did see Emma meeting someone there last week. A man in a suit. They talked in his car for almost an hour. The revelation settled like ice in my stomach. I pulled up the photo of Vincent DeMario's business card, comparing it to the surveillance footage from yesterday. The man in the SUV, same build, same expensive suit, same air of professional menace. Back in my car, I opened my laptop again, this time accessing our home security system's archive footage. Hours of video revealed a pattern. Emma's Thursday appointments always involved meetings with DeMario, always 2 blocks from home, always with that manila envelope exchanging hands. But it was the footage from our home office that broke something inside me. There was Emma methodically going through my desk at 3 a.m., photographing documents, copying files. The woman I'd watched sleep beside me for 5 years moved like a stranger in the dark, her actions precise and purposeful. My phone buzzed again. Emma. Running late? Dinner's getting cold. The concern in her message felt like another piece of evidence, carefully crafted to establish a timeline, an alibi, a story she was writing where I played an unwitting role. The lasagna would be perfect, I knew. Everything she did was perfect now. Each gesture orchestrated for an audience I couldn't see. I thought of the origami crane she used to make, each one containing a reason for her love. When had those reasons turned into surveillance notes? When had her touch transformed from comfort to choreography? The rain continued its steady rhythm, nature's metronome counting down to something I could feel approaching like distant thunder. Opening my glove compartment, I pulled out the small velvet box containing her original wedding ring, the one I'd found in her jewelry box last week, discarded like evidence she needed to dispose of. In the dim light, its inscription caught my eye. To my true north, forever yours. The irony of those words twisted in my chest as I finally allowed myself to face the predator that had been stalking the edges of my consciousness. My wife wasn't just lying about salon appointments or business meetings. She was systematically documenting, planning, building something much darker. And the Richardson project payment, my routine, the life insurance push, they were all pieces of a puzzle I was finally starting to see. A puzzle that looked increasingly like a trap. The lasagna was still warm when I finally walked through our front door, its aroma a cruel reminder of simpler times. Emma stood in our kitchen, illuminated by the soft glow of pendant lights we'd chosen together, wearing the apron I'd given her last Christmas. The domesticity of the scene felt like a photograph taken of strangers wearing our faces. "You miss my calls," she said, her voice carrying just the right note of wifely concern. I watched her hands as she served the food, steady, practiced, betraying nothing of the woman I'd seen in the security footage, methodically photographing my documents in the dead of night. Battery died. I lied, matching her performance. The taste of deception was becoming familiar on my tongue, like a language I never wanted to learn but was forced to speak. She tilted her head slightly, a gesture I once found endearing. Now I saw it for what it was: calibration, assessment, measurement of my response. "You seem distracted lately," she offered, sliding into her chair. "Is it the Richardson project?" The project. The payment. The minimum criminal threshold. Each word felt like a tripwire in a maze I was only beginning to understand. "Just tired," I said, watching her watch me. The food turned to ash in my mouth as I remembered her notes, my schedule, my routines, my habits documented with clinical precision. What else had she been recording? What else had she been planning while I slept beside her, trusting and oblivious? I was thinking, she began, her fork moving in perfect, measured bites. Maybe we should take that trip we talked about. After the life insurance paperwork is sorted, of course. Somewhere peaceful, just the two of us. Something in her phrasing sent a chill down my spine. I remembered an entry from her notebook partially visible beneath the surveillance notes. Location requirements, remote, minimal. The rest had been hidden, but now my mind filled in possibilities, each more horrifying than the last. "When did you change your wedding ring?" I asked suddenly, the question escaping before I could stop it. For a fraction of a second, her mask slipped. I saw something flash behind her eyes, calculation, perhaps, or fear. Then it was gone, replaced by practiced confusion. What do you mean? She held up her hand, the replica ring catching the light. This is my ring. The one you gave me when you proposed at sunset on Marina Beach. I proposed at sunrise. I corrected quietly. On Lighthouse Point. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma's fork paused halfway to her mouth, her features frozen in a tableau of domestic tranquility that suddenly seemed as artificial as stage lighting. In that moment, I saw something else in her eyes, not guilt or shame, but something closer to tactical reassessment. She recovered smoothly, laughing softly. Of course, sunrise. I'm just tired. Work has been. She launched into a story about client demands, her words flowing like water around the rocks of her deception. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was remembering something else, a detail so small I'd almost missed it in the security footage. As Emma had photographed my documents that night, she'd received a text. The phone screen had illuminated her face for just a moment, and her expression hadn't been one of calculated deception. It had been fear. What exactly had Vincent DeMario and his legal consultancy trapped my wife into? Or was she the architect of this elaborate deception, with me as her unwitting blueprint? The lasagna grew cold between us as I watched her perform the role of loving wife. Each gesture now seeming like evidence in a case I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. Because somewhere beneath the layers of deception and surveillance notes, beneath the replaced ring and manufactured memories, a terrible question was taking shape. Was I watching a predator at work or another victim? That night, after Emma had fallen asleep, I stood in our en-suite bathroom, studying my reflection in the mirror where she applied her makeup each morning. The counter still held traces of her daily transformation. Brushes arranged with military precision, products lined up like soldiers awaiting inspection. Everything in its place, just like the surveillance notes in her notebook, just like the carefully crafted lies about salon appointments and break-ins. But that flash of fear in the security footage haunted me. It didn't align with the methodical predator who documented my routines, who planned something involving criminal thresholds and life insurance policies. Fear suggested vulnerability, and vulnerability suggested what? A puppet master pulling strings I couldn't yet see? I opened her makeup drawer, something I hadn't done in years. Beneath the perfectly organized cosmetics lay a small pink notebook I'd never seen before. My hands trembled as I opened it, recognizing Emma's handwriting, but different from her surveillance notes. This was rushed, emotional, the ink blotched in places as if from fallen tears. He says there's no way out now. The plan has to proceed. God forgive me, but what choice do I have? If Nathan ever discovered... No, I can't think about that. I have to protect him, even if he ends up hating me. Better hatred then. The entry cut off abruptly. The next page had been torn out, but the impression of her pen had left ghost-like traces. I held the notebook at an angle, trying to decipher the phantom words, when I heard a sound from our bedroom. Nathan? I quickly replaced the notebook, my heart thundering. When I returned to the bedroom, Emma was sitting up in bed, her face strange in the moonlight. For a moment, she looked like the woman I'd married. Vulnerable, real, her mask of perfect control slipped away. I had that dream again, she whispered, and something in her voice made me pause. The one about the beach house. We'd never had a beach house. This was another performance, another carefully constructed scene in her elaborate play. But her hands were trembling as she pushed her hair back. The first genuine tell I'd seen in weeks. Which beach house? I asked carefully, watching her face. Her eyes widened slightly, realizing her mistake. The mask slammed back into place so quickly it was almost visible. Just a dream, she said smoothly, lying back down. Sorry to wake you. I stood there in the darkness, piecing together fragments. Her fear in the security footage, the tear-stained notebook entries, this slip about a beach house. Each piece suggested a story different from the one I'd been constructing. A story where Emma wasn't just the architect of deception, but perhaps its first victim. My phone buzzed softly. An email notification from our home security system. New footage from our backyard camera. Emma, earlier that day, while I was at work, pacing near the garden we'd planted together. In the footage, she was arguing with someone on her phone, her free hand gesturing frantically. Even without audio, her distress was palpable. Then she stopped, suddenly rigid. The person on the other end must have said something significant. Emma's shoulders slumped in defeat, and she nodded slowly before ending the call. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the garden as if memorizing it. Then she wiped her eyes, straightened her posture, and transformed back into the perfect, controlled woman who had served me lasagna hours later. I watched the footage 3 times, each viewing revealing new layers of complexity. The woman who documented my routines with clinical precision was also the woman who cried in our garden when she thought no one was watching. The question was, which version was the real Emma? The predator, the prey, or something more complicated? A woman trapped in a web of her own making, now unable to find her way out? As if an answer, my phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. Ask your wife about Operation Lighthouse. Time's running out. Operation Lighthouse. The words pulsed in my mind like a warning beacon as I watched Emma sleep, her face finally peaceful, stripped of its careful choreography. In slumber, she looked like the woman who had once spent an entire Sunday helping me plant wildflowers in our garden, laughing when the spring rain caught us by surprise. Now that garden had become a place where she cried in secret, carrying burdens I was only beginning to understand. My fingers hovered over the unknown number that had sent the text. The mention of Lighthouse Point, where I had actually proposed, couldn't be coincidence. Someone was watching us, playing a game where both Emma and I seemed to be pawns rather than players. Dawn crept in like a reluctant witness as I slipped out of bed, drawn back to the en-suite bathroom. The pink notebook called to me like a siren's song of truth. This time, I photographed each page with trembling hands, knowing my time was limited. The entries painted a disturbing picture. V says everything's in motion now. The accounts are set up. He knows about Mom's medical bills, uses them like a knife against my throat. Says if I don't cooperate, she'll lose everything. Nathan would help if I told him. I know he would. But V has proof of what I did before, when I was desperate. Says he'll make sure Nathan sees everything if I breathe a word. The entry trailed off into a shaky scrawl. I remembered Emma's mother's sudden recovery last year, how Emma had brushed off my questions about the experimental treatment's cost. At the time, I'd been so relieved by her mother's improvement that I hadn't pushed for details. My phone vibrated again. Another text from the unknown number. Time to see who your wife really is. Check the false bottom of her jewelry box. Code is your anniversary. I stood frozen, torn between invasion of privacy and desperate need for truth. The jewelry box had been my anniversary gift to Emma 3 years ago, a handcrafted wooden piece with a digital lock. I'd had our wedding date engraved inside, 05-22. But when I carefully lifted it from her dresser and entered those numbers, nothing happened. Then I remembered her earlier slip. She'd forgotten where I'd proposed, but she'd also forgotten when. With shaking fingers, I tried the date she'd started her surveillance notes. 02-15. The box clicked open. Inside, beneath a false panel that I'd never known existed, lay a USB drive and a stack of photographs. The first photo showed Emma crying, her face twisted in anguish, while a man in an expensive suit, Vincent DeMario, gripped her arm. The timestamp showed 2 months ago, right when her behavior had first started to change. The next photo stopped my heart. Emma at a beach house I'd never seen, handing something to a man whose face was carefully blurred. The photo was dated 5 years ago, before we'd met. Paper clipped to it was a note in unfamiliar handwriting. Remember what happened last time you tried to be noble? He deserves to know who he really married. My hands shook as I reached for the USB drive, but Emma's voice from the doorway froze me in place. Don't, she whispered, her voice raw with emotion I hadn't heard in months. Please, Nathan, if you see what's on that drive, everything changes. Not just for us, but for... She stopped, pressing her hand to her mouth as if physically holding back words. When she looked at me, her eyes held no calculation, no performance, only pure, undiluted fear. "They're not just watching you," she whispered. "They're watching us, right now." As if to confirm her words, both our phones buzzed simultaneously. The same message from different unknown numbers. Time for Act 3. Hope you both know your lines. The space between us in that moment felt infinite yet suffocating. 5 years of marriage condensed into the distance between her trembling hand and the jewelry box I still held. The early morning light painted shadows across Emma's face, and for the first time, I truly saw them. The fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the slight downturn of lips that used to smile so freely, the weight of secrets pressing down on shoulders that had once danced with me in summer rain. "They have photos of the beach house," she whispered, each word carrying the weight of long-buried truths. "From before I met you, before I became me." Her fingers twisted her replica wedding ring, a nervous tell from the real Emma breaking through her carefully constructed facade. I set the jewelry box down between us like a bridge or a barrier. I wasn't sure which. "The beach house you mentioned in your sleep, it wasn't just a house." Her voice cracked, the polished veneer finally splitting to reveal something raw underneath. "It was where everything started, where Vincent first." She stopped, her eyes darting to the window as if expecting to find shadows watching us. Perhaps they were. I thought of the surveillance notes in her notebook, seeing them now through a different lens. Had she been documenting my routines to protect me or endanger me? Or somehow, impossibly both? "The Richardson project payment," I said softly, watching her face. "The criminal threshold you noted. Was it their idea or yours?" Emma's laugh held no humor, only a bone-deep weariness. "Do you know what the hardest part has been?" She moved to our bedroom window, pressing her palm against the glass like she was reaching for escape. "Watching you trust me. Every morning, every smile, every time you reach for me in your sleep. Knowing what they wanted me to do to you." The dawn light caught tears on her cheeks. Real ones this time, not the choreographed emotion she'd been performing for months. "Your greatest flaw, Nathan, is that you build everything to last. Even trust, even love, even when they're being used as weapons against you." My phone buzzed again, the unknown number now hauntingly familiar. Tick-tock. The USB drive, or the police get an anonymous tip about the Richardson payment. "Your choice, Mrs. Chun." Emma's shoulders stiffened at the sound, but she didn't turn around. "There are things on that drive that will make you hate me," she whispered to her reflection. "Things I did before I knew what love could be. Before you taught me that not everything beautiful is meant to be broken." I moved to stand behind her, close enough to see the pulse racing in her throat, but not touching. Not yet. In the window's reflection, I watched her close her eyes, tears clinging to her lashes like morning dew. "Better hatred than a prison jumpsuit," she added so quietly I almost missed it. "Better you alive and hating me than—" She stopped abruptly as both our phones lit up simultaneously with a series of rapid-fire texts. "Time's up. Hope you enjoyed the rehearsal. Opening night tomorrow. Don't forget your lines, Mrs. Chun, or someone else pays the price." In the growing light of dawn, I watched Emma's reflection transform one final time. Not into the perfect, controlled wife she'd been playing, but into something harder, more desperate. A woman preparing for war. "I'm so sorry, Nathan," she whispered, reaching for her phone. "But I have to make this call. Remember that everything I've done, everything I'm about to do, was to protect." The rest of her sentence was lost as sirens began wailing in the distance, growing closer with each heartbeat. The sirens grew closer, their wail piercing the delicate membrane of our moment like a knife through silk. Emma's hand trembled as she raised her phone, each number she dialed feeling like another nail in a coffin I couldn't yet see. "It's done," she spoke into the phone, her voice hollow. "He's here, just like you wanted. You'll keep your end of the deal." A pause, then, "I understand. Yes, the evidence is ready." The word evidence hung between us like poison gas. I thought of all the surveillance notes, the documented routines, the Richardson payments sitting in our account like a loaded gun. Everything she'd collected, everything she'd prepared. Was it meant to protect me or destroy me? They're going to arrest you, she whispered after ending the call, still facing the window. Dawn painted her reflection in watercolor strokes of gold and shadow. The Richardson payment, the fraudulent documents, the evidence of money laundering. It's all there, carefully constructed. Perfect. By you, I said softly. For you. She finally turned, and I saw something break behind her eyes. Do you know what they threatened to do if I didn't help them? What they showed me could happen to you if I refused. Her hands clenched into fists. The photos from the beach house weren't just about my past, Nathan. They were proof of what they're capable of. The sirens were turning onto our street now. Red and blue lights began to dance across our bedroom walls like a macabre light show. Your mother's medical bills, I said, pieces clicking into place. That experimental treatment last year, it wasn't real, was it? The treatment was real. The bills were real. Her laugh was bitter as winter frost. But the miracle recovery? That was the hook they used to reel me in. They own the medical facility, Nathan. One word from them, and they'll stop her treatment. She'll, her voice cracked. I couldn't let that happen. Not after everything she sacrificed for me. Squad cars were pulling up outside our house. Through the window, I could see officers approaching our front door, hands hovering near their weapons. So you chose to sacrifice me instead? The words tasted like ash. No, Emma whispered, reaching for my hand. For the first time in months, the touch felt real. No calculation, no performance, just desperate truth. I chose to make you look guilty enough to get arrested, but not guilty enough to be convicted. The evidence I planted, it'll fall apart under scrutiny. I made sure of it. Understanding dawned like a cold sun. You're building me an alibi. They wanted me to destroy you completely. Instead, I'm giving you 48 hours in custody She stopped as pounding began on our front door. While I fix what I started. At the beach house, the doorbell rang, its cheerful chimes surreal against the backdrop of sirens and shouted commands. Emma stepped closer, pressing something into my palm. A small key I recognized from her jewelry box. The real evidence is in a safety deposit box. Everything you need to understand, to fight back. But Nathan, her eyes held mine, fierce with a love I finally recognized again. Whatever you hear about me in the next few days, whatever they say I've done, remember this moment. Remember that I chose prison for myself over a coffin for you. The front door burst open downstairs, footsteps thundering up toward us. Mrs. Chun, an authoritative voice called out. This is the police. We have a warrant. Emma's hands squeezed mine one last time before letting go. As officers flooded into our bedroom, she turned to them with perfect composure, her mask of control firmly back in place. But I had finally seen beneath it, and nothing, not the handcuffs closing around my wrists, not the Miranda rights being recited, not even the evidence she had so carefully constructed, could make me unsee the truth in her eyes. My wife wasn't the architect of my destruction. She was its first contractor, forced to build something she never designed. The interrogation room's harsh fluorescent lights turned everything into sharp edges and stark shadows, not unlike the way arrest had crystallized my understanding of Emma's deception. Every loving gesture I'd questioned, every lie I'd caught her in, now refracted through a new lens. Protection twisted into performance. Love transformed into elaborate stagecraft. Mr. Chin, Detective Morris said, sliding photographs across the steel table. Would you care to explain these transfers? The documentation was flawless. Every transaction Emma had carefully constructed, each piece of evidence she'd planted. Perfect enough to justify arrest, she'd said, but designed to crumble under scrutiny. I studied the papers, seeing her handiwork in every detail, remembering how she used to arrange her makeup brushes with the same precise attention. Your wife provided some interesting information, Morris continued, watching my face. Claims you've been using the Richardson project as a front for money laundering. Says she discovered it accidentally and felt compelled to report it. The betrayal should have felt like a knife to the heart. Instead, it felt like watching a play where I finally understood my role. Emma's words echoed in my mind. Remember that I chose prison for myself over a coffin for you. I'd like to speak with my lawyer, I said quietly, my fingers unconsciously touching the spot where Emma had pressed the safety deposit box key into my palm. Hours blurred in the holding cell, each minute marked by the weight of that key against my skin. I thought of Emma in our garden, crying when she thought no one could see. The surveillance notes, the documented routines, not ammunition for destruction, but parameters for protection. She'd been building me an alibi, while they thought she was building my downfall. A guard appeared, holding a cell phone in an evidence bag. "Found in your pocket during processing," he said. "Interesting text messages on here." I remembered the unknown numbers, the threatening texts. Had Emma known they would search my phone? Had that been part of her design too? Breadcrumbs leading away from whatever truth waited in that safety deposit box? "Your wife's story is falling apart already," Detective Morris announced during our second interview. Inconsistencies in her statement. Documentation that doesn't quite add up. Almost like it was meant to. I finished softly. His eyes narrowed. "She's not who you think she is, Mr. Chun. We've uncovered some interesting history. A beach house in Newport 5 years ago. A case involving—" "No," I interrupted, Emma's desperation finally making sense. "She's exactly who I think she is. Someone who would rather be seen as a betrayer than watch someone she loves get hurt." Morris leaned back, studying me with new interest. "You don't seem very surprised by your wife's allegations." Surprised? I thought of Emma's tears in our bedroom, the truth finally breaking through her carefully constructed facade. "No, I'm not surprised. I'm ready." "Ready for what?" I met his gaze steadily. "To understand what really happened at that beach house. To know why my wife would rather go to prison than let me see what's on that USB drive. To find out who's really behind the Richardson payment setup. And how exactly do you plan to do that from a holding cell?" I thought of Emma's words. 48 hours in custody while she fixed what she started. Whatever she was planning at the beach house, whatever truth waited in that safety deposit box, she'd given me the perfect alibi. I couldn't be involved in anything that happened while I was in police custody. "I don't need to do anything," I said quietly. "Everything's already in motion. Has been for months." My wife made sure of that. As if on cue, a junior officer burst into the room. "Sir, we got a situation. Someone just broke into the evidence room at Central. The Richardson files, they're gone." Morris rushed out, leaving me alone with the ghost of Emma's last touch, the phantom weight of her truth against my palm, and the growing certainty that somewhere out there, my wife was dismantling a trap that had been years in the making. I just prayed she'd survive her own demolition. 48 hours in custody felt like watching our marriage through time-lapse photography. Every moment of doubt, every questioned gesture, every suspected lie now transforming in meaning, like shadows shifting with the sun. The holding cell's silence became a canvas for memory. Emma's tears in our garden, her trembling hands on that final morning, the way she'd whispered, "Remember this moment," before they took me away. Detective Morris returned on the second day, his expression unreadable. "Your wife's disappeared." The words should have surprised me. They didn't. "The beach house," I said quietly, watching his face. "Have you checked the beach house? What do you know about that property, Mr. Chun?" He placed a photograph on the table between us. The same beach house from Emma's hidden photos, but older, worn by salt air and secrets. Because our investigation has uncovered some interesting history. 5 years ago, before you met her, your wife was involved in a case that was buried. A new voice interrupted. A man in an expensive suit entered the room, federal badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. "Detective Morris, this case has been reassigned. Mr. Chun is being released." Morris's protest died as the agent placed a document before him. I watched the detective's face pale as he read, understanding blooming in his eyes. "The Richardson evidence?" Morris asked. "Inadmissible," the agent replied smoothly, "as is everything else connected to this case. Mr. Chun, you're free to go. Though I should warn you, your house is currently a crime scene." The drive home felt surreal, each familiar street now bearing the weight of Emma's carefully orchestrated protection. My phone had been returned, wiped clean of the threatening texts. The key to the safety deposit box remained heavy in my pocket, untouched by the police search, exactly as Emma had planned. Yellow crime scene tape crossed our front door like a warning. Inside, our bedroom had been transformed into a tableau of investigation. Fingerprint powder dusted our surfaces like morning frost. Evidence markers dotted the floor like breadcrumbs leading to truth. On our bed lay a single sheet of paper, placed with deliberate care. A bank statement from 5 years ago, showing a transfer of exactly the amount Emma had noted as the minimum criminal threshold. The recipient, Vincent DeMario's law firm. The sender, a company I'd never heard of, registered to the address of that beach house. My phone buzzed. An unknown number, but different from before. She told us everything, Nathan. About the beach house. About what really happened that summer. About why she agreed to their plan. Check the box. She left you the key for a reason. I touched the safety deposit box key, remembering Emma's words. Everything you need to understand to fight back. Another text arrived. Did you ever wonder why she chose you? An architect who builds things to last? Someone who would notice every detail, document every inconsistency? She needed someone who would see through her performance. Someone who would understand why she had to make you look guilty enough to be arrested, but innocent enough to be freed. The final text felt like Emma's voice in my head. The beach house holds the truth. But ask yourself, why did they want you in custody for exactly 48 hours? What could she accomplish in that time that required you to have a perfect alibi? Standing in our bedroom, surrounded by the debris of investigation, I finally understood. Emma hadn't been documenting my routines to destroy me. She'd been proving where I wasn't and couldn't be, while she dismantled whatever nightmare had begun in that beach house 5 years ago. My wife hadn't betrayed me. She'd cast me as the lead in her perfect alibi. While she went to war with ghosts, I was only beginning to understand. The safety deposit box key felt like it was burning through my pocket as I stood in the bank's sterile fluorescent lighting. The clerk's movements seemed deliberately slow, each procedural step an eternity, until finally, I was alone with the metal box that held Emma's truths. Inside, beneath a stack of documents, lay a single USB drive and a handwritten letter in Emma's flowing script. Nathan, by now you know about Vince. I'm sorry you had to find out this way. Vince. Not Vincent DeMario, but Vince Torres, the supposed hairdresser who'd never touched a pair of scissors in his life. The man Emma had been meeting during her fake salon appointments. The memory of their surveillance footage encounters took on a new, sickening dimension. The USB drive contained footage from the beach house security cameras, dated 5 years ago. Emma, younger and somehow more vulnerable, entering the house with a man I now recognized as Vince. Their body language intimate, familiar. Then Vincent DeMario arriving, his expensive suit a contrast to the casual beach setting. The way Emma's entire demeanor changed, fear replacing intimacy. More recent footage followed. Emma and Vince in his black SUV, but not in the way I'd imagined. Her voice trembled as she pleaded, "They'll kill him if I don't go through with this. You know what DeMario's capable of. You were there that day at the beach house. You shouldn't have married him." Vince's voice was soft, almost sad. "You knew they'd eventually use him against you. Use us against you." The final video made my hands shake. Emma in tears as Vince held her. "I have to make Nathan hate me," she whispered. "I have to make him think I've been unfaithful. It's the only way to keep him safe while I finish this. DeMario will be watching. He has to believe I'm betraying Nathan, or they'll know I warned him." Letters and documents filled the rest of the box, painting a picture I'd never imagined. Emma and Vince had been undercover agents investigating DeMario's operation 5 years ago. The beach house, their surveillance location, had become a crime scene when their cover was blown. DeMario had escaped prosecution, but not before ensuring he had leverage over both of them. My marriage hadn't been a lie. It had been a target, used by DeMario to control Emma, to force her participation in his schemes. And Emma, my brilliant, desperate wife, had found a way to protect me by seeming to betray me, crafting a performance of infidelity with her former partner while they worked to dismantle DeMario's operation from within. The final document in the box was a federal case file dated yesterday. Emma's testimony, given while I was safely in custody, unable to be implicated or threatened. Vince's corroborating statement, DeMario's entire operation laid bare. 5 years of evidence finally seeing light. My phone buzzed one last time. The performance is over. Come to the beach house. It's time you knew everything. The message was signed with a single initial, E. The drive to the beach house felt like traversing the landscape of my marriage. Every mile marker a memory rewritten. Every turn a truth newly understood. The setting sun painted the coastal road in shades of amber and shadow, much like the layers of deception and protection that had colored our life together. Emma's perfume still lingered in our car, the scent I'd dismissed as evidence of betrayal now revealing itself as the mark of her desperate performances with Vince. Each staged meeting, each carefully documented encounter, had been brushstrokes in a portrait of infidelity painted to protect me from becoming DeMario's next victim. The beach house emerged from the gathering dusk like a confession taking shape. Its weathered exterior held 5 years of secrets, its windows reflecting the last rays of sunlight like tears caught in amber. 2 cars were parked in the crushed shell driveway, Emma's and another I recognized from the surveillance footage as Vince's. Before I could reach the door, it opened. Emma stood in the threshold, her face stripped of the careful mask she'd worn for months. In the golden hour light, I saw every line of exhaustion, every shadow of fear she'd hidden beneath her performance. "You found everything in the box," she said softly. It wasn't a question. "Why didn't you tell me?" The words carried the weight of every doubted moment, every questioned touch, every suspected lie that had actually been an act of protection. "Because you build things to last, Nathan." She stepped aside, letting me enter the house that had started everything. Your trust, your love, their foundations laid so deep that even knowing they might be used against you, you wouldn't have stepped away. DeMario would have seen that, would have used it. The beach house's interior was a time capsule of that fatal operation 5 years ago. Evidence boards still lined the walls, covered now with dust sheets like shrouds over buried truths. Vince stood by the window, his stance military precise, watching the perimeter out of habit. "Show him," Vince said quietly. Emma moved to one of the boards, pulling away the sheet. Photographs cascaded across the timeline. DeMario's operation laid bare, the corruption, the murders disguised as accidents. And there, in the center, a photograph of another architect who had died in a construction accident 3 years ago. "That was Robert Kane." Emma's voice cracked. "He was like you, brilliant, trusting, built things to last. His wife was one of our agents. When she refused to help DeMario launder money through construction projects." She stopped, hands trembling. "They made it look like an accident," Vince finished. "That's when we knew we had to go deeper underground. When Emma met you." He glanced at her, something like regret crossing his features. "We didn't know you were an architect at first. By the time we realized, she was already in love, already vulnerable. So you staged the ultimate betrayal," I said, understanding finally blooming like night-blooming jasmine. "Beautiful, but with a bitter edge. Made it look like you were having an affair, documented every meeting, every touch, every lie. Created a performance so convincing that even DeMario would believe it. While gathering evidence," Emma whispered, "while building a case strong enough to end this. Every time I broke your trust, I was trying to save your life. Every lie was a shield. Every betrayal a protection." She stepped closer, close enough that I could see tears catching the last light like diamonds. "I had to make you doubt everything about me, Nathan. Because your trust." Her voice broke. "Your trust is so beautiful, so absolute, that it would have gotten you killed." Behind us, Vince moved suddenly, his hand going to his weapon. "They're here," he said quietly. "Right on schedule." Car doors slammed in the growing darkness. Emma's hand found mine, squeezing once, real, true. No performance left between us. "Ready for the final act?" she whispered. The beach house filled with shadows as night crept in, each darkened corner holding fragments of Emma's sacrifice. Through the windows, I could see car headlights cutting through the gathering dark. DeMario's men approaching like wolves circling their prey. But this time, the prey was ready. "Nathan," Emma's voice was soft but urgent, her hand still in mine. "Whatever happens next, Know that every moment of doubt I gave you, every trust one seemed to break, they were the hardest choices I've ever made. Loving you was the only real thing in this whole performance. Vince moved with practiced efficiency, checking his weapon. Emma, it's time. The door burst open before she could respond. Vincent DeMario stood in the threshold, his expensive suit incongruous against the weathered beach house interior. Two armed men flanked him, their weapons trained on us with mechanical precision. How disappointing! DeMario's voice dripped with artificial concern. Mrs. Chun, we had such a perfect arrangement. You play your part, your husband takes the fall, and your mother continues receiving her treatments. Simple. Clean. Instead, he gestured at the evidence boards. You chose to resurrect ghosts. The only ghost here, Emma's voice carried steel beneath its silk, is Robert Kane. His death wasn't enough for you? How many more architects did you plan to sacrifice for your money-laundering scheme? DeMario's laugh held no humor. Architects. Soprisas, sotrastori. The perfect patsies for moving money through construction projects. Your husband would have been an excellent addition to our portfolio of accidents. That's why you needed me to document everything. I said, understanding blooming like night flowers. Every routine, every schedule. You weren't building evidence against me. You were documenting my patterns for them, making it easier for them to make my death look accidental. But she played them. Vince spoke from the shadows. Every documented meeting between us, every staged intimate moment. It wasn't just to convince DeMario of her betrayal. It was proof that she was never alone with you, never had the opportunity to warn you. Proof that when this all came down, I couldn't possibly be involved, Emma finished. Because I was too busy destroying my marriage to be building a case. DeMario's smile faltered as federal agents emerged from every shadow of the beach house, weapons drawn. The evidence boards illuminated under tactical lights. Each photograph, each document, now testimony to years of patience and pain. Vincent DeMario, Agent Marshall's voice cut through the chaos. You're under arrest for the murder of Robert Kane, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder. As agents swarmed the house, Emma turned to me, her eyes holding every truth she'd never been able to speak. I chose to let you hate me rather than bury you, she whispered. I chose to break your trust rather than your family's heart. Ishos. You chose to protect me, I finished, drawing her close, even when it meant destroying yourself. Later, as dawn painted the beach in watercolor promises, we stood in the garden of the beach house. Evidence tape fluttered in the morning breeze like prayer flags, each one marking a deception finally unveiled, a truth finally spoken. Can you ever trust me again? Emma asked, her voice small against the rhythm of the waves. I thought of every detail I'd questioned, every gesture I doubted, how each perceived betrayal had actually been an act of desperate love. How she dismantled our marriage piece by piece to prevent it from becoming my coffin. I trust that you would tear your own heart apart to protect mine, I said softly. I trust that every lie you told held a deeper truth. I trust that loving me was the one role you never had to perform. She leaned into me. No more masks, no more performances. Just Emma, real and raw, and finally free to be the woman I'd fallen in love with. The one who had loved me enough to let me hate her. Behind us, the beach house stood as a testament to sacrifice and survival, its shadows now holding not secrets, but strength. Like our love, it had weathered storms and deceptions, emerging scarred but standing. Emma had been right about one thing. I did build things to last, including forgiveness. If you like the vid, please follow to the channel, and don't forget to like the video. See you soon.